All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, aka Mr. Delks Moses, aka Mr. Anoints Himself with Grease, governed by Caprice. We are here continuing our Book to React series with Book to React 10, and this is episode 8, where we are continuing Neil MacMaster's famous book. Now that it's famous, it's because it's on the Book to React series. And this is Racism in Europe from 1870 to the year 2000. This is a book that came out in 2001. You can pick it up on Amazon for only $22.52. Great book, and we've already completed part 1 and the introduction of this text, covering yesterday the history of anti-black racism throughout continental Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, and today we're diving into anti-Semitism. We don't have any new comments under the Book to React section for today's episode, so we're just going to be jumping into the text, and I'll be giving reactions to it as we continue. And if anybody jumps into the comment section, I will try to respond as quickly as I can. So let's get into it. The rise of political anti-Semitism. Some historians perceived hatred of the Jews to be an eternal racism that, in spite of minor shifts in its formulation, can be traced back over 2 millennia as essential and abiding components of European culture. Shout out to Ozzy. He says, salute Simon, ready for class. Shout out to Ozzy. Shout out to Kamal. Shout out to everybody who's going to join in and react as we continue to learn together. I'm trying to be an educator here, but I'm also learning with y'all. So this is a community-based learning, reading book club. So let's continue. Basically, in this first sentence, he says that, many historians viewed anti-Semitism as essential components of European civilization for 2 millennia. While such lines of continuity certainly can be found, for example, in the mythical view of the Jew as deicide, what such an essentializing approach tends to overlook is the extent to which anti-Jewish prejudice itself changed radically according to the historic context. How a Catholic artisan and guildsman of 14th century Toledo or Prague, situated within a feudal and pre-industrial age, looked toward his Jewish neighbors was grounded in a total worldview that was quite unlike the perception of a factory worker of the late 19th century, living within a capitalist and secular age. So basically what he's saying here, similar to anti-blackness, right, or similar to the perceptions of black people, how ancient people view Jews is very different from how modern people view Jews. If you're living under feudalism, it might be totally different than how we view the other under capitalism, right? Through the many centuries of European history, long phases of quite stable and relatively unchanging anti-Jewish patterns of prejudice can be contrasted with more dramatic watersheds or short periods of crisis, when the traditional archetypes have tended to fragment under stress and pass through a major restructuring and reformulation before those new ways of seeing in turn became stable and enduring. Such a point of transition emerged during the 1870s and gave rise to a type of anti-Semitism racism that was to remain dominant in its new formulation down to the present. This transformation can be analyzed as a shift from a centuries-old anti-Judaism that was fundamentally religious in meaning and pre-modern to a new anti-Semitism that, in keeping with a secular age, constructed Jewish difference through the biological and naturalizing categories of racial science. So basically what he's saying here is like, in medieval times, back in the days when the Europeans would burn the Jews alive on a pyre or, hang Jews or do pogroms randomly all across Europe, that's different than anti-Semitism, because back then it was based on the Jews' identity as a religious group. But in the secular age, the Jew became a body that was biologized. Their Jewish identity became essentialized to their being, right? This is when we get the formation of like Jewish DNA or Jewish blood, etc., which unfortunately still permeates. So, however, the racialization of anti-Jewish discourse, the adoption by propagandists of a scientific language of difference, was one element within a complex ideology that was essentially an expression of the anti-modernist and anti-democratic sentiments of social groups faced with crisis: conservative Christians, decaying aristocratic landowners, the petite bourgeoisie, small shopkeepers, and artisans in decline, and which integrated to a vast range of concerns, from xenophobia and radical nationalism to nostalgia for the passing of a traditional rural order. Anti-Semitism as a form of racism can only be made sense of if it is placed within this broader context. So basically, we have to think about anti-Semitism as a product of the new modern capitalist age, rather than something that is so ancient and integral to European identity. Of course, throughout European history, Jews were, ostracized, othered, killed, etc. But we have to examine it from the lens of how capitalism morphed society. This chapter is divided into two parts. Firstly, anti-Semitism is considered as an ideology that was formulated primarily through print by propagandists, writers, politicians, academics, and other members of the educated elite. This generalized form of ideological anti-Semitism, like other currents of race science, could be found right across Europe and sharing the same basic themes and constructions, regardless of the specific national, social, economic, and political context. The second part then examines the social and political forms of anti-Semitism and the extent to which the ideological formations filter down and influence the attitudes and behavior of a wider public. Here we need to look more closely at the specific national context, since the general process of modernization, from industrialization and urbanization to banking and agrarian reform, and the related crises of transformation varied enormously across Europe. So did the national and regional context within which anti-Semitism took root. The question of the varying national formulations of anti-Semitism and the depth of their impact on society from the 1870s onwards will be examined in relation to three geographic zones that exemplify the key types and range of anti-Semitic development, from the more advanced industrialized liberal democracies of Western Europe, Britain and France, through a central constellation, Germany and Austria, to the underdeveloped peasant societies and autocracies of Eastern Europe, Poland and Russia. By the way, guys, if it sounds like I'm tired or if it sounds like my voice is low, it's because, man, I've had a relaxing day. I just came back from the baths here in Budapest. And so, yeah, I'm at chill mode today. This ain't turned up, Simon. We might get turned up if a white supremacist happened to the chat. But generally, we're just going to be reading and chilling and not doing too much. Today's live stream won't be too extra. Continuing here. Anti-Semitism as ideology. The first part examines the general features of anti-Semitism as an ideology, as a system of thought relating to the political, economic, and social order. At one level of analysis, anti-Semitic works appear to be hopelessly confused, contradictory, irrational, and therefore lacking in the internal consistency that historians of ideas normally expect to find within a rational system of political thought. I mean, that was generally like my understanding quickly of like anti-Semitism. Like when I was a kid, right, and 9/11 happened, and there were a lot of documentaries that came out, like 9/11, truthers, or man, I forgot one, Loose Change. Yeah, I remember watching Loose Change as a kid. You know what I mean? As 9/11, was happening in the fall, like that, right? And yeah, there were some parts of it and some other parts of the internet that were permeating the idea that the Jews were behind it, right? And with, Loose Change and other documentaries like Zeitgeist, like you can easily fall down a rabbit hole where like anti-Semitism or like anti-Jewish beliefs can permeate, right? And that could happen even amongst black folks, right? Even though we have a history that's very similar to Jewish people of being like castigated and ostracized and abused and killed just for our identity. I never was able to make sense of the anti-Semitism that was in those beliefs, because it doesn't make sense. Like just to say like, hey, a small cabal of Jewish merchants or a small cabal of Jewish businessmen or bankers, whatever you want to put in, control everything in society. And they do it so well that you don't even notice, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, there's a collaboration of Caucasians at the top from every single background that dominate this world under the system of white supremacy. That makes a lot more sense than to have this view that only the Jews are running things. So I remember thinking those thoughts as like a young man coming into like understanding of the world, but I never, went down the full path of me saying like, hey, the Jews are the bad ones. You know what I mean? Anyway, continuing here. So, for example, Jews were seen as both the key agents of capitalism, bankers, stock market traders, as well as of revolutionary socialist organizations that sought to overturn capitalism. Jews were hated for trying to assimilate into Gentile society, as well as for remaining apart. The Jews were accused of promoting scientific materialism that undermined religious faith, and also acting as diabolic agents, a dark and occult force that remained loyal to the Talmud and to the blood libel, the ritual murder of Christian children. Underlying such apparent and often puerile inconsistency lay an inner unity and cohesion, as Stephen Wilson notes. It was a system of belief that provided a total explanation of a supposed state of cosmic and social decadence by identifying the Jews as the evil agents of that dislocation and decay. Anti-Semitism was highly attractive precisely to the extent that it could resolve the contradictions and tangled confusions of modernity through oversimplifying universal causes that could appear quite cogent to common sense opinion. It was able to provide a total explanation for every conceivable ill in modern society through the diabolical causality of a great Jewish conspiracy that was, from behind the scenes, intent on achieving global domination through the control and manipulation of entire national economies and political systems. As Urbain Gohir explained in The Jewish Terror, watchwords launched by the heads of the Jewish nation in whatever part of the world they find themselves are transmitted, heard, and obeyed immediately in every country, and countless obscure and irresistible forces immediately prepare for the desired effect, the triumph or ruin of a government, an institution, an enterprise, or a man. I also wanted to say, I remember being in university, the first time I was in university, in my bachelor's program and in New Orleans, right? This was around 2012, 2013, and I was getting high at one of my friend's houses. His name was, I'm not going to drop his name, but he had another friend there, right? And me and this other friend, we were smoking, talking, and then he started telling me about how if you go on top of the Pyramid of Giza and hold up a light bulb, then the light bulb will shine, right? And I'm like, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's true, cuz. And so then he's like, yeah, it's true. Like, scientists have proven it. And I'm like, okay, interesting. So then he starts, after talking about the pyramids of Giza, he then tells me, you know, at Auschwitz and all the other concentration camps, there's no way that gas could kill all those people, because under the doors, the gas would escape. And you can look at the pictures and see that the doors don't close all the way. So the gas couldn't kill people, therefore the Holocaust didn't really happen. And I was like, what? That was the first time. The first time in my life I ever heard someone do Holocaust denial was in university, unfortunately. And that goes to show, like, for all the people that are worried that universities are becoming too woke, or that universities are making kids into social justice warriors or crazy radical blue-haired communist liberals, whatever, don't worry. In every university I've been to, I've heard some of the wildest, most right-wing evil things you could ever imagine, like Holocaust denial. I heard Holocaust denial at a liberal private university, man. Anyway, continuing here. So the central characteristic of such a paranoid ideology is that it could always prove that any misfortune was the work of Jews, even in the absence of any evidence. Indeed, the very absence of proof was itself seen as an indication of the insidious and diabolical power of the Jews to suppress the truth, particularly through the ownership and control of the press by Jewish magnates and journalists. It was in the very nature of such paranoid forms of thought that they were not open to critical evaluation by the normal standards of proof. Conspiracy theory enabled anti-Semites to present a single cause for every great and petty hatred in society, from dislike of modern art and feminism to fears of moral decline and degeneration. When the carpets of the anti-Semitic propagandist Edward Drummond were soaked in January 1910 by the sign in the flood, he found the inevitable answer. Upstream from Paris, he claimed, extensive deforestation had destroyed the natural cover and the retention of rainwater. This destruction was the work of greedy and ruthless Jewish entrepreneurs. Of course, something bad happens to a white man, you gotta blame somebody else, because white people love being the victim. They love playing victim. Anyway, this instance provides an example of the way in which modern anti-Semitism reformulated traditional and age-old stereotypes of the Jew as the rapacious and antisocial exploiter into a pseudo-scientific rationalist discourse of natural causation that fitted in with modern secular perceptions of the world. The popular appeal of anti-Semitism was precisely the fact that it offered clear and simple answers to extremely complex and disturbing questions, from the causes of unemployment and economic depression to rising crime and immorality. As Michael Winnock notes, herein lay the very modernity of anti-Semitism, in that, in a new age of the masses, it knew how to capture the people's attention through providing a simplification and fictional why for the misfortune of the world. An action cannot be grounded in too subtle or too nuanced an analysis of the living context. In contrast, it becomes a rallying cry if it is based on a universal causality and the mythological system of representation that allows people to bypass the rational approach. Basically, what they're saying here, how I'm interpreting it, is that, as modernity came, people couldn't just say that the Jews were magical or the Jews had secret powers or mind control techniques. They had to rationalize it. So when anything bad happened in society, they would say, yeah, greedy Jewish businessmen somehow, some way caused the decline of capitalism, and also at the same time, crazy radical Jews want to bring communism and destroy our way of life under capitalism that we cherish so much. I don't know how this works in my mind. Let me pray to my Jewish God, Jesus Christ, to make it make sense. This is how the mind of the anti-Semite, anti-Jewish white supremacist worked. Continuing here. Anti-Semitism developed as a coherent ideology during a period of gestation from circa 1860 down to the late 1880s, and by 1890 could be found in the works of numerous ideologues and propagandists, from Wilhelm Marr and Otto Glogau in Germany to Széchenyi and Istosi in Hungary. That's so crazy. Like, Széchenyi is like a famous name in Hungary, right? Like, there's the Széchenyi baths. But I guess he was a famous anti-Semite too. I should bring that up. So, Schronerer in Austria and Drumont in France. The similarity in the key ideas across Europe arose from the fact that anti-Semitism was international in scope. Major thinkers readily borrowed ideas from one another. While the first and the second anti-Jewish Congresses at Dresden, there's an anti-Jewish Congress. That's insane. That's insane that a bunch of people got together for an anti-Jewish Congress in Germany in 1882, and Chemnitz in 1883 saw the direct contact of representatives from Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Romania, Serbia, and France. Anti-Semitism was fully formed as a system of ideas by 1890, and very little new was later added to the ideological formulations and remained largely unchanged between the late 19th century and the present day. In the following section, the structures of this anti-Semitism are analyzed with reference to 5 major themes relating to the economy, religion, nationalism, decadence, and biological racism. Interesting stuff. I could imagine like all the world leaders of today go into like an anti-Jewish Congress. That's hilarious. Now they're lining up behind Israel. Now they're letting Israel kill medics on camera in front of the whole world, letting children burn alive in camps just for the sake of protecting Israel. Anti-Semitism is not cool, but neither is Zionism as well. Let's continue here. Economic anti-Semitism. The Jews had been viewed by European society for many hundreds of years as a group that was peculiarly adept at money lending and commerce, and forms of usury and economic exploitation that were regarded as both unethical and parasitic on the main body of hard-working Christians, who generated true wealth through hard labor. Type of anti-Jewish sentiment was reformulated to fit in with an age in which the vast expansion in finance, capitalism, the growth of modern banking, stock exchange activity, paper money, and currency manipulation was associated with all the worst aspects of uncontrolled capitalism. Both conservatives and socialists attacked the rise of enormously wealthy magnates, the accelerating oppression and exploitation of the working class and peasantry, and the creation of unearned fortunes through cunning manipulation of money markets, speculation, and fraud. Anti-Semitism drew much of its critique of contemporary capitalism from socialism and Marxism. But whereas the latter, in spite of hints of anti-Jewish bias, interpreted exploitation fundamentally in terms of class interest and the relations of production. Basically what they're saying here is like, a lot of the early anti-Semites around this time were basing their critiques of the Jews through a socialist or Marxist lens. The Marxists believe that, the owners of the means of production are the ones who control society and exploit the working class I could understand how somebody very easily could say, yeah, the owners of the means of production, meaning the Jews. Of course, somebody could reach that conclusion if they have two brain cells. But if you have three, you can see that there are a lot of different people who own the means of production. It's not just Jewish people. All right, continuing here. So, in spite of hints of anti-Jewish bias, they were reinterpreted exploitation fundamentally in terms of class interests and the relations of production. The former placed as much stronger emphasis on the primary function of the Jews. For the anti-Semites, the Jews were the key driving force behind all forms of rapacious capitalism, able to exert a frightening and growing stranglehold over the world's economy through an international network of financiers. The perceived enormous wealth of Jews connected directly to their ability to monopolize the press, control public opinion, ruin and displace the ancient landed aristocracy, and as nouveau riche, or new rich people, to flaunt themselves as owners of great country estates and as patrons of high society restaurants, theaters, and social networks, from which they would have been previously excluded. This anti-capitalist position of anti-Semitism enabled it to make an appeal to diverse groups and interests that were losing out in the crisis of modernization: small peasants, artisans, and landed gentry who were going under, and members of the bourgeoisie who lost money in the stock market crashes, like that of 1873, or found entry to the professions, law, medicine, journalism, increasingly competitive and difficult. All right, so basically what they're trying to say here is that, the Marxists who were anti-Semites would critique the Jews, for being rich and owning capitalism and things like that. But basically, they're saying that the Jews were using their wealth and power as the owners of the means of production to enter places that they wouldn't have allowed to enter before because they were Jewish. All right, continuing here. So, religious anti-Semitism. The religious roots of anti-Semitism were ancient. Traditional anti-Jewish prejudice had been inspired since the origins of Christianity by a worldview that had made the Jewish people, as Goncourt claimed, a race bespattered with the blood of a god, and collectively guilty of the worst crime imaginable. Jews, it was thought, were commanded by their religion to subvert, abuse, and defile everything that was held most holy by Christians, and the age-old persecution of the Jews was fueled by rumors of symbolic inversion of the sacred, desecration of the host, and the blood libel or ritual murder of Gentile children at Passover. Such traditional forms of anti-Jewish belief, far from disappearing in the late 19th century, were integrated into the new anti-Semitic movements, where the potential mass audience was still most profoundly religious, as in the Catholic populations of rural France, Germany, Austria, and Poland, or Orthodox Russia. Anti-Semitic agitators emphasized the old crude themes of Jewish diabolical intent. But in general, religious anti-Semitism was marked by a major restructuring and the modernization of its discourse. So once again, basically saying that something was ancient in the past, but it had to be modernized, right? So anti-blackness might have been modern in this time, or a part of its era, but then it changed as it moved forward, all right? So, continuing here. Traditional anti-Jewish Traditional anti-Jewish prejudice was tempered and moderated by the paradoxical belief that the Jews were an essential component of Christian eschatology, in which the second coming of Christ depended on their conversion. The mission of the church was the conversion of the Jews, and orthodoxy maintained that after baptism, the Jews became a full member of the Christian faith and community. This doctrine was at odds with modern racism, which was built on the idea of radical difference. Each race was so fixed in its essential characteristics that it was impossible for individuals to cross over the divide and assimilate into another group. While racism formulated radical exclusion mainly through biological and scientific theory, religious anti-Semitism achieved an identical goal through cultural formulations and the precept that the Jew remained a Jew even after conversion. Baptism of the Jew was as effective, it was claimed, as trying to wash a blackamoor white. Basically, a Jew could no longer become a Christian just as much as a black person could become a white man, right? Because it is a part of your essential nature. And let's just keep it real, like let's be frank, like being Jewish is a religious choice. It is a cultural choice. Maybe it's something that some people are born into. Maybe it's something people choose to do. Maybe it's something people reject and choose not to identify as. I think we need to stop racially essentializing Jewish people. I think we should stop racially essentializing Jewish people. But I think that's up to Jewish people to do. Like the same way maybe a black person says, I don't want to be black anymore or identify as black or be racialized as black. I believe that's their right to do it. I believe that's their right. And I think it's up to the Jewish community to say that we are a religious group first. There is no such thing as like Jewish blood. And let's keep it real. There are Jews of all different types and stripes. There are Jews that can be racialized as white, as black, as Asian, as Indian, etc., right? So yeah, let's continue here. Emancipated and assimilated Jews in Western Europe during the course of the 19th century had become closely associated with a dynamic liberal culture that placed a high value on education, intellect, scientific thought, and progress. The church, which by the late 19th century was in crisis and facing the challenge of secularism, scientific explanation of the universe, socialism, and militant anti-clericalism, portrayed the Jews as engaged in a war against Christianity, the agents of a subversive, rational tradition that originated in the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Anti-Semitism endowed Jews with an essential way of thinking, a corrosive intellect that was materialistic and profoundly opposed to the Christian worldview and to spiritual values. Religious anti-Semitism was able to find a single scapegoat, an explanation for the huge weight of complex modernizing forces, from industrialization and urbanization to rural decline and the collapse of traditional hierarchies and values that did, in reality, present an enormous threat to the church. However, while the church was in crisis by the turn of the century, it still held an enormous influence and used its considerable power over public opinion through the pulpit, church, schools, and Catholic mass circulation newspapers to disseminate anti-Semitism. Interesting. So basically, the church was being challenged by people who were, proud of being scientists, proud of living a life of the mind. And the church is all about follow what we have to say dogmatically. Don't even read the Bible for yourself. We'll tell you what to do, right? So this is going back to the ancient roots of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiment, right? But as the world began to modernize, the world caught up to the, anti-Semitism that was prevalent before, or the anti-Jewish sentiment that was prevalent before modernization. So, degeneration and anti-Semitism. A third strand in anti-Semitism relates to the theme of decadence and degeneration. As we saw in Chapter 1, European bourgeoisie society in the late 19th century was profoundly suffused with a sense of morbidity, decay, and cultural pessimism, while modern racism began to analyze this in terms of social Darwinism and biological deterioration. This anxiety also found expression through anti-Semitism. Traditional anti-Judaism had, since the pogroms of the Middle Ages, portrayed the Jews as a dangerous internal enemy, which insidiously threatened the very life force of Christian society through the poisoning of wells and the deliberate spreading of the plague. Increasingly, through the 19th century, anti-Jewish discourse was peppered with images or metaphors of the Jews as a monstrous fungus, a parasitic growth that fed upon the healthy body of the host society, finally reducing it to an emaciated and sickly shell. This age-old paranoia was taken on board by modern anti-Semitism. But once again, we find that the traditional formulations were increasingly expressed through a secular and scientific language. The Jew was viewed in biological terms as a race that carried tainted and diseased blood in its veins, a source of dangerous bacilli, a venereal disease in vague but horrifying germs that threatened to infect European society. Exclusion of the Jews, the construction of a barrier against social contact and intermarriage, was expressed through a language of pathology that played upon the profound and often irrational anxiety of contemporary society towards sexual disease and degenerative illness. The rather nebulous and thus all-inclusive concept of degeneration also extended to the closely interlinking concepts of physical health and morality. The Jews were viewed as the major organizers of prostitution and the white slave trade, and anti Semitic texts betrayed an exaggerated and lurid prurience, a heated sexual fantasizing about the other, a mixture of sexual loathing and fascination that equated Jews with moral corruption, physical deformity, and disease. So it sounds very similar to, like, Jewish discourse today. On the one hand, we have the white supremacists all over the internet saying, the Jews this, the Jews that, but at the same time, they're talking about big Khazar milkers, and they're worried about Abby Shapiro's titties. And yeah, they still lust after certain Jewish women as being, sexually attractive and stuff like that. So it's like, what you find the most perverse is also what you find to be the most erotic most of the time. Deep down in people's souls, I believe deep down, what people find the most disgusting, they find the most sexually arousing, I would say. So, nationalism and anti-Semitism. A fourth component in anti-Semitism was related to a deepening form of closed or exclusionary nationalism that sought to define itself, the concept of a homogeneous and cohesive group identity, over and against the threat posed by an internal alien presence. Throughout late 19th century Europe, nationalism assumed an increasingly conservative and aggressive form that was partly linked to the insecurities of deepening international tensions and anxieties about the security or integrity of the nation state. Nationalist ideologies rooted in Romanticism and conservative traditionalism emphasized the idea that membership of the homeland could only be acquired through descent from countless generations of forebears from the ancient Volk, or people who carried the culture, language, and spiritual values of the nation in their blood. In opposition to xenophobic nationalism, the Jews were seen as profoundly alien, a dangerous and subversive foreign element lodged within the territory and fabric of society. Jews, it was thought, constituted a nomadic race that had no roots, no sense of belonging, and since they clung to their own ancestral customs and religion, they constituted a state within the state. In an age when patriotism and sacrifice for country was infused with powerful religious feelings, the Jew was perceived as a profound danger, a person who owed primary allegiance to his own race, nation. In particular, nationalist anti-Semitism targeted the Jews as cosmopolitan, members of an international network or nation of Semites whose perfidious goal was the subversion, weakening, and destruction of the homeland through the control of global finance, the organization of Marxist revolution, or the fomentation of destructive wars between states. The paranoid image of the Jew as the enemy within was to find expression in countless spying panics, of which the Dreyfus affair was the most famous, or in challenges to the patriotism and reliability of Jewish soldiers during times of national crisis or war. Although for purposes of analysis, the various strands of economic, religious, degenerative, and nationalistic anti-Semitism have so far been treated separately, in reality, the standard discourse wove all of these elements into a powerful cross-referential matrix. Endless numbers of texts could be quoted to illustrate the typical flavor and structure of anti-Semitic discourse. But here, a single passage from a newspaper of 1891 will suffice to show how the themes of parasitism, destructive capitalism, global conspiracy, and anti-nationalism were typically woven together. The Rothschild leeches have for years hung on with distended suckers to the body politic of Europe. This family of infamous usurers, the foundation of whose fortune was laid deep in the mire of cheating and scoundrelism, has spread itself out over Europe like a network. It is a gigantic conspiracy, manifold and comprehensive. There is a Rothschild, a devoted member of the family, in every capital of Europe. Vienna, St. Petersburg, Paris, London, Berlin are each and all garrisoned and held for family purposes by members of this gang. This blood-sucking crew has been the cause of untold mischief and misery in Europe during the present century, and has piled up its prodigious wealth chiefly through fomenting wars between states which ought never to have quarreled. So yeah, this is stuff that I remember hearing like when I was like very young. The Rothschilds, the different like noble, rich families that own everything, right? When you start hearing about wealth disparity, it could come from usually two places. Usually it's like conspiratorial, like the Rothschilds and all these other secret Illuminati type families own all the wealth, or you're getting the introduction to wealth disparity like through a Marxist or socialist lens, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people, I feel like, get exposed more to like the conspiratorial stuff. A lot of people understand or hear about the Illuminati before they ever hear about a critique of capitalism from the Marxists or the socialists or the communists. Continuing here. So, here the Rothschilds were seen as not only a hideous and monstrous growth, a parasite that reached across Europe, but also as the instigators of international conflict and war, which, through putting nation states at each other's throats, simultaneously weakened these societies while making huge profits at their expense. Such Jews could obviously have no sense of national identity, of patriotism, or belonging. Scientific racism and anti-Semitism. The fifth and final element to be considered is the specifically racist components in anti-Semitic ideology. The term anti-Semitism, which was a neologism probably first used by Wilhelm Marr in 1879, and which certainly gained currency in the same year through the foundation of the German Anti-Semitic League, was specifically racial in its formulation since it referred to the Semites, a group that was defined by contemporary scholars as a people of the Middle East who were biologically and linguistically quite distinct from the European Aryan. The new term, which spread very rapidly into popular usage, marked a shift from traditional forms of anti-Jewish prejudice that were fundamentally religious to a type that was based on scientific criteria. Anti-Semitism appealed much more readily to a secular age in which historical and social phenomena were interpreted through a rational and scientific approach that included physical anthropology, material culture, evolution, geography, climate, and linguistics. Racial anti-Semitism facilitated an ideological position, freed from the restraints of Christianity that erected a radical barrier between immutable groups that were locked into their physical and mental differences. Drumont, in La France Juive, 1886, a work of enormous influence that by 1914 had attained 200 editions, presented history as an endless conflict between the enthusiastic, heroic, disinterested Aryan and the money-grasping, scheming, clever, and deceitful Semite. He reflected the new thinking in describing his work as an ethnographical, physiological, and psychological comparison of the Semite and the Aryan, these two personifications of races that are distinct and irredeemably hostile to each other. The Belgian anti-Semite Picard also wrote in 1892 of this essential biological difference. Of race, one can say that it is irrevocable. It is not altered by any change or milieu. It persists. It is always there, like one of those mineral poisons which once introduced into an organism can never escape analysis. Basically, you are what you are. If you're black, you're black. If you're white, you're white. And there's no such thing as changing. People are not, creations of their society or their culture, their language, their history, right? It's just because of their race. That's how they act a certain way. With whatever disguise a Semite living among us may masquerade, he will remain himself in his body and more so in his soul. Should he interbreed with one of us, his Semitic blood will affect all his issue. We know enough about hereditary for this point not to be insisted upon. Racial anti-Semitism showed a profound ambiguity towards the Jews. The Jews of Europe in the late 19th century could be divided in a rough and ready way into two main types. In Eastern Europe, the Orthodox, Yiddish-speaking, and highly traditional Hasidic Jews, often living in ghetto conditions of considerable poverty, were immediately recognizable by their dress, culture, and language. By contrast, in Western Europe, emancipation and upward social mobility had led to a remarkable integration of Jews. Many had converted or abandoned all signs of Jewish observance and were completely indistinguishable in physical appearance and culture from their fellow British, French, or German citizens. Anti-Semitism delighted in its gross caricatures of the so-called Ostjuden, or Orthodox Jews, who moved westwards in their hundreds of thousands in the 1880s to escape Russian persecution. The Orthodox or ghetto Jew enabled anti-Semites to deploy the most grotesque traditional images of the Jew as an immediately recognizable physical type, invariably dirty, repulsive, hook-nosed, and yellow-skinned. Like Dickens' Fagin, who, distinguishable by his kaftan and red beard, seemed like some loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth by night in search of some rife offal for a meal. Basically, Charles Dickens was an anti-Semite too. He's got a racist depiction of a Jewish man in one of his books. See, I never liked Charles Dickens. Never liked him. By contrast, what was profoundly disturbing to anti-Semites about the integrated Western Jews was that they could not be spontaneously identified in the crowd. And it was this very invisibility that rendered the Jew a far more dangerous and frightening presence, operating secretly and destructively within the bowels of society. Richard Wagner described the assimilated Jew as a master of disguises, a plastic demon, and his physiognomy and form changes. He conceals himself, he slips through the fingers like an eel. Today he wears court livery, and tomorrow drapes himself in a red flag. One doesn't recognize him. Unnoticed, he invades all circles. The modernizing Jew was, ironically, far more disliked than the Orthodox and highly traditional Jew, an antipathy that arose from the fact that it was the assimilating Jews, highly educated and ambitious, who presented a major challenge to the Gentile domination of both the universities and employment in the professions, particularly in medicine, the law, and journalism, in banking and commerce, the civil service, and political office. The contradiction between an anti-Semitism which attacked Jews for their refusal to abandon tradition and to assimilate, and an anti-Semitism that attacked the Jews for denying their ancient roots and modernizing, was resolved by the usual conspiracy theory. The French anti-Semite Huguenot de Mousseau claimed in 1869 that the split between Orthodox and Reform Jews was a cunning strategy for world domination. The first group, the indestructible nucleus of the nation, would retain the Talmudic way of life, while the latter were sent out as emissaries to penetrate and subvert the Gentile world from within. The problem faced by the anti-Semites was how to contain the Jews, how to halt and reverse the gains made possible by emancipation, and to find techniques that would enable the identification of the invisible, their symbolic marking, and their exclusion from the nation, and Volk. The problem here was that the modern Jews, those that offered the greatest challenge, could no longer be readily identified through religion. The growth of a racial anti-Semitism from the 1870s onwards was in part an attempt to reconstruct and reassert ethnic hierarchies that were rapidly disintegrating, to rebuild and reinforce breached defenses that would keep the enemy outside. Scientific racism presented itself as a rational technique of identification. The Jew might try to disguise himself as one of us by conversion, change of family name, and other ruses, but his true nature was irrevocably stamped in biology, to be revealed by the scalpel, the microscope, and the anthropologist's calipers. However, the prime logic of racial anti-Semitism to demarcate the Jew as irredeemably other could find expression through cultural and literary forms, as well as biological science. For example, in a macabre short story by Oscar Panizza, The Operated Jew, 1893, the grotesque anti-hero, shout out to whoever's sending hearts out there. All right, anyway, Oscar Panizza, The Operated Jew, 1893. The grotesque anti-hero, the Jew, Itzig Fatal Stern, poses all of the most exaggerated and absurd qualities of the traditional anti-Semitic stereotype. He is deformed and twisted, bow-legged and diseased, has thick black locks, fleshy lips, a hooked nose, yellowish goggle eyes, speaks with a nasal twang and a rich amount of saliva, and presents the spectacle of a monster, a dreadful piece of human flesh. Stern spends his fortune on a complex and painful psychophysical operation operation, a medical transformation or plastic surgery that will transform him into a good German. His twisted bones are broken and reset by surgeons, his hair bleached golden by drugs, his Yiddish accent removed by speech therapy, and his Jewish blood is totally replaced through a transfusion of blood from a strong peasant woman. Basically, this man underwent the Michael Jackson transformation surgery. Before Michael Jackson turned into a rich white woman, this Jewish man in this play underwent the same thing. All right. Itzig, now Siegfried Freudenstein, passes as a Gentile and marries a blonde German girl. But as the wedding feast, he gets drunk and grotesquely reverts to a racial type. His nasal voice returns, his face becomes sensual and fleshy, his eyelids droop, his hair begins to curl and changes from blonde to red, then to dirty brown and jet black. And he begins clicking his tongue, gurgling and tottering back and forth while making disgusting, lascivious, and bestial canine movements with his rear end. Oh, disgusting. Okay. This is like Kafka's Metamorphose, but more sick. All right. Apart from the strong undertow of sexual prurience, the horror of miscegenation, and racial pollution, the story is a powerful assertion of the inescapable physical and psychological difference of the Jew, a difference that is constructed through a naturalist vocabulary and scientific racial scrutiny. So far, we have looked at anti-Semitism mainly in terms of ideas, but intellectual history alone can tell us very little about the wider causes of anti-Jewish racism and how and why particular social groups were drawn towards such sentiments. What was distinctive about the new forms of anti-Semitism that emerged from the 1870s was not only its ideological shape, but the fact that these ideas were elaborated simultaneously by ever-widening circles of ideologues and political propagandists until they became a common currency. The following exploration of the map of anti-Semitism, based on the three constellations of Central, Eastern, and Western Europe, begins with an examination of the central area represented by Germany and Austria. Both countries shared similar features of late but rapid industrialization, fragile liberalism, rising German nationalism, a remarkable ascent of Jews into financial and professional circles, and the organization of the most significant anti-Semitic political parties prior to the First World War. All right. So now we're going to jump in a little bit. This will be the last section that we're going to be reading today. Anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria. Trying to make it to page 100 because 100 is a good number to land on. So, anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria. Contrary to expectations, the number of Jews in Germany was not particularly high, rising from 512,153 in 1871 to 615,021 in 1910. Figures that, as a percentage of total population, actually represented a decline from 1.13% to 1.0%. Within Austria, leaving aside the sprawling multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire, Jews numbered about 180,000 in 1910, or 2.5% of total population. Despite these relatively low and even stagnant numbers, anti-Semitism between 1870 and 1914 was in part fueled by growing Jewish visibility, a perception of a rapid increase in numbers and power, and anxiety that they were set to conquer the Germanic peoples. The visibility or prominence of the Jews arose from three factors. Firstly, there was a growing internal migration of Jews from poor rural areas into the major cities, where they often became concentrated in slums. Secondly, political persecution of the Jews in Russia and desperate poverty in Eastern Europe led, after 1881, to an enormous westward flow of Jewish refugees. Although only 70,000 were allowed to settle in Germany, most of the diaspora of 2.7 million Jews across the Atlantic, there was a deep anxiety that Jews would pour over the borders from Poland and Russia, where 75% of the world's Jewish population was located. The Jewish population of Vienna grew dramatically from 6,000 to 1857 to 175,318 in 1910, most of them refugees from Galicia. The Eastern Jews, with their distinctive dress and language, appeared as a barbaric throwback to the most primitive anti-Semitic stereotypes. In 1879, the influential historian Treitschke warned of the dangers of an invasion of Posen by all the filth in Polish history. There was nothing German about these people, with their stinking kaftans and their obligatory lovelocks, except their detestable mongrel speech. However, for the anti-Semite, by far the most threatening Jewish presence arose not from the impoverished and alien Ostjuden, but from the rise of the highly westernized assimilated Jews. The period from 1850 down to 1871 had been a golden age for German Jews. They were widely tolerated, and even before the German Emancipation Law of 1869 removed all limitations, they had taken full advantage of newfound acceptance and opportunities in order to forge ahead. The Jewish community, with its highly literate culture, achieved a remarkable degree of upward social mobility through educational achievement and entry into the professions, particularly medicine, law, journalism, and finance. The dynamic rise of the Jews also led to their overrepresentation in many sectors, where they constituted a percentage that was much higher than their presence in the overall population. In Prussia, for every 100,000 Jewish males, 519 went into higher education, while for Catholics and Protestants, the figure was 33 and 58, respectively. The competition from Jews at a time of over-provision of graduates led to an anti-Semitic backlash on students and professional associations, and moves to impose quotas or a total exclusion. So basically, the Jews were saying, like, we need to get educated. We need to, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And in this society, people say, hey, if you're smart, if you work hard, if you read the books, if you do the homework, you can succeed. So the Jews did that, and the whites said, no, this has to be a conspiracy. The Jews can't be doing this well. Why are they taking over our institutions? Basically, when they can't compete, they then start to, scream that it's a conspiracy, that it's wrong, this isn't the way it's supposed to work, right? So during the course of the 19th century, the Jews, in their battle for emancipation, had become closely allied with political and economic liberalism, the advance of parliamentary democracy, the extension of civil rights, equality before the law, and overall values of rationalism and progress. In Central and Eastern Europe, it was the historic weakness of the bourgeoisie, linked to late industrialization, that had given the Jews such a prominent role as modernizers, as investors, and industrialists. During the late 19th century, the Jews came under increasing attack as a symbol of modernizing forces, of the rapid industrialization and urbanization that appeared to be destroying traditional society. Unlike Britain and France, where the Industrial Revolution had started much earlier and evolved gradually, Germany and Austria were affected by an accelerated and more traumatic pace of change. Germany, in particular, faced the tensions and upheavals produced in a traditional society by an almost unprecedented advance in new technologies, backed by capitalist finance. The anti-Semitic political parties that began to appear from 1879 onwards were able to recruit among urban groups that were in crisis as a result of the stock market crash of 1873 and the following economic depression that lasted until 1896. Typical victims of change were the small shopkeepers of Berlin and Vienna, who blamed their problems on Jewish-owned department stores and retailers, or the artisans and self-employed who could not compete with large-scale industrial enterprise. Anti-Semitic propagandists shared much of the socialist critique of capitalism as an exploitative and inhumane system, but crucially blamed the Jews, rather than class relations, for the crisis which they were undergoing. An interesting example of the links between economic modernization and the growth of populist anti-Semitism can be found among the peasants of Hessenland. German agriculture prospered between 1850 and 1870, but by 1871, Hessenland was undergoing a transition to capitalist forms of farming, linked to the penetration of railways and access to urban markets. The peasants who clung to the old open field system faced depressed agricultural prices, indebtedness, bankruptcy, and the loss of mortgaged lands. Jews played a major role in the region, as they did throughout Central and Eastern Europe, as cattle dealers, traders, and moneylenders. Otto Buckel, the so-called peasant king from 1885, began to establish an electoral base in Hesse through an anti-Semitic movement that blamed the evil Jews for the farmers' plight and mobilized the peasantry through the use of modern propaganda techniques. Buckel established his own newspaper, organized mass meetings, torchlit rallies, and songfests, set up credit cooperatives and legal advice centers, and built up a network of grassroots activists through anti-Semitic clubs, the Reformwehren. I don't know what that is, but basically the reformers. Through such modern and innovative techniques of mass party organization, Buckel was able to gain a sensational victory in the 1887 election at Marburg. The possibility of such mass politics was crucially dependent in Germany and Austria, as in many other European states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, on the extension of the vote, and, in this respect, modern anti-Semitism can be integrally linked with the extension of parliamentary democracy. Karl Lueger, the famous mayor of Vienna, who so impressed the young Adolf Hitler, was able to build up a power base in the city through a demagogic and opportunistic anti-Semitism that appealed to the little man, the artisans, shopkeepers, clerks, teachers, and minor functionaries who felt most threatened by Jewish competition. It was precisely this group, the Five Florin Men, who had been enfranchised in 1882 and who held the key to the control of Vienna, who were cultivated by Luger's skillful populism. Modern anti-Semitism was not, however, a phenomenon that found support solely among those groups that were facing economic and social crisis from the advance of industrial and financial capitalism. Of equal importance was the growth of reactionary and defensive forms of nationalism that appealed strongly to thriving and successful members of the middle and upper classes, to academics, lawyers, editors, writers, doctors, and businessmen. In Germany from 1879, there was a distinct sea change towards a conservative, closed nationalism as Bismarck faced with economic crisis, the rise of the Social Democratic Party, and potential revolution, opted to resolve internal problems by channeling growing tensions into aggressive nationalism and social imperialism. It is no coincidence that at the very moment the German society was mobilizing against external dangers, it should also turn against the Jews as an alien internal threat to national solidarity. A widespread view was that emancipation had been granted to Jews on condition that they become totally assimilated in society as an integral part of the nation. Yet the Jew, it was felt, showed a perverse tendency to retain their religious and cultural identity and sense of apartness. Anti-Semitic writers marked a shift from an assimilatory discourse, which insisted on the total disappearance of the Jews through religious conversion, intermarriage, and other forms of integration, to a racial language that emphasized the radical non-Germanness of Jews, for which the only solution was physical exclusion or expulsion from the nation. Adopting the ideas of French racists like Gobineau and Drumont, or the Volkish and anti-modernist romanticism of German nationalists like Paul Delagarde and Julius Langbehn, and the Anglo-German Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the whole of history was interpreted as a constant race warfare between the blonde, heroic, and inventive Aryans and the parasitic, cowardly, and destructive Jews. The ideal of a strong and spiritual German Volk was associated with an ancient bloodstock and organic community which was rooted in the soil, the forest, and landscape. It was precisely the life of the peasantry and of venerable cathedral cities, so powerfully evoked in contemporary romantic literature and arts, that was thought to be the most threatened by the corrosive forces of capitalism, industrialism, and the soulless materialism orchestrated by cosmopolitan Jewry. In the late 19th century, the boundaries of the German race were increasingly seen as identical with the boundaries of the nation, and this aggressive national racism fed into the Austrian pan-German movement led by the anti-Semitic agitator George Ritter von Schronerer, and into the Pan-German League. Historians are in disagreement as to the impact of anti-Semitism on German and Austrian society before the First World War. The various German and anti-Semitic parties, the German Reformers, the German Socialists, and the Christian Socialists, having reached a peak with 16 seats in 1893 and 3.3% of the votes, were in decline by 1896, and by 1914, after 30 years, had not achieved one of their declared aims. Too many historians, looking for the roots of Nazism, have badly distorted our understanding of the past by selecting out all the most extreme examples of anti-Semitism from before the First World War, while neglecting the considerable forces arrayed against it. In Germany and Austria before 1914, political anti-Semitism was restricted in scope by a number of factors. Firstly, the dominant forces of conservatism, wedded to authoritarianism and traditional elitism, were horrified by the growth of the new forms of power seen as dangerous and as distasteful as socialism. More crucially, the Wilhelmine state, as well as Austria under the rule of Emperor Franz Joseph, upheld the rule of law in the defense of Jews and deployed its power to contain and restrict anti-Semitism. For example, the Civil Service Decree of 1892 forbade state officials, and especially teachers, from being active in the anti-Semitic parties, while between 1893 and 1915, the public prosecutor brought 537 individuals to trial for anti-Semitism. The enormously powerful Social Democratic Party, while it had individual members tainted by hostility to Jews, maintained a solid opposition to anti-Semitism and prevented it taking deep root in the working class. Many members of the middle class only confided their anti-Semitism in private letters and diaries, a sure indication that the open expression of prejudice was still felt to be socially unacceptable in educated circles. Very interesting. I'm not doing much reaction here because I'm actually getting exposed to a lot of information that I haven't heard before. I'm not that familiar with the history of anti-Semitism in Central and Eastern Europe, right? So this type of stuff, I'm going to be a bit more quiet and just soak it in rather than react directly to it. Plus, on top of that, your boy is super relaxed. I'm super relaxed right now. I ain't got much to add on. Fascinating stuff here. By the way, let's check and see how many more pages. All right, so we're just going to wrap it up with these last few paragraphs. So, in spite of this limited success of anti-Semitism, which surged and declined, in spite of this limited success of anti-Semitism, which surged and declined with the onset and end of the Great Depression of 1873 and 1896, there exists a broad consensus among historians that all the essential ideas of interwar anti-Semitism were already fully developed between 1870 and 1914, and also widely diffused into German and Austrian culture. Before 1914, it seems likely that specifically scientific and biological forms of racial anti-Semitism were made almost universally available, although not necessarily accepted by the middle class and working class intelligentsia, through a vast array of propaganda sources, from newspapers and novels to the activities of nationalist organizations like the Pan-German League, the Navy League, the Agrarian League, and the Army League. Evidence for the relationship between elaborated forms of racial anti-Semitism and popular culture can be provided by Otto Bokel's Farmers' Movement in Hessenland. In a pamphlet of 1887, The Jews, Kings of Our Time, which became a classic of anti-Semitism. That's funny. Jews, Kings of Our Time. We was kings. Bokel set out to expose appalling cases of Jewish usury and exploitation of the peasantry. In his Volkish idealization of rural life, the way of our ancestors, and of the destructiveness of the Jews, he presented the latter in pseudo-scientific terms as a tenacious ancient race that is remote from our own and that cannot be disposed of through baptism or mixed marriage, an alien race that thinks differently, feels differently, and acts differently from us. However, Bokel, who had a superb feel for the culture and mentality of the peasantry, modified the more sophisticated and overtly racist language that he directed towards an educated middle-class audience for a more populist discourse when he addressed the peasantry. In his campaigning newspaper, the Rischenrode, he replaced a scientific form of racism with one that appealed more to the traditional Christian anti-Judaism of the farmers. The rhetoric of anti-Semitic ideologues could take on a pseudo-scientific or naturalist expression without having to be formulated in a technical way. For example, in 1893, the Bavarian Catholic priest and politician George Ratzinger stated with social Darwinian overtones, "Parasitism can no more be tolerated in commercial life than in nature. If it is not stopped, it will overrun all other higher forms of life." A further example of the way in which racial anti-Semitic filtered downwards from high into popular culture by an almost invisible but powerful osmosis is provided by Hitler's account in Mein Kampf of his early days as an unemployed down and out in Vienna. The fragmentation and ineffectiveness of organized political anti-Semitism in Germany and Vienna prior to 1914 led its opponents to underestimate its force. In 1906, the socialist leader Babel remarked of anti-Semitism, "It is consoling that it has no prospect of ever exercising a decisive influence on political life and social life in Germany." That's hilarious. That's hilarious. That's like saying, oh, don't you know, reality TV stars and fake billionaires will never become presidents of the United States, right? Like, that's funny. Anti-Semitism was, however, slowly finding its way into the organizations of students, teachers, judges, and other professional groups, into the Protestant and Catholic churches, nationalist leagues, as well as into a myriad of propaganda outlets, from novels and newspapers to theaters and popular clubs. Anti-Semitism was endemic, not so much as a set of abstract ideas or intellectual choices, but rather as a complex of feelings, prejudices, and thoughts, such that the simple word Jew immediately triggered a set of associations of hostility and revulsion, ranging from fears that German identity was endangered by cosmopolitanism and revolutionary socialism to deep anxieties about parasitic capitalism, materialism, feminism, homosexuality, social reform, treachery, miscegenation, and racial degeneration. In an inverse direction, the radical anti-Semitic propagandist Theodor Frisch was capable of making lengthy speeches without once mentioning the Jews by name, by utilizing a standard lexicon that was known to all. The word Jew thus became a metaphor for everything that was most un-German, and it was this mindset entrenched within culture and language in the late 19th century that was transmitted forward into the First World War and an apocalyptic era of mechanized killing, revolution, and the radical dislocation of all economic and social certainties. Very fascinating stuff. Very fascinating stuff. You know, I didn't give much reaction to that because a lot of that was new information for me, right? Some of the other stuff that I've heard about blackness and the history of blackness and the transformation of anti-black sentiment over time is familiar to me. But a lot of the stuff related to, you know, this framing that the idea that, you know, anti-Semitism is not an ancient thing. It's a new modern thing that picked up on something that was older but transformed it, which makes sense in my mind because, you know, like all other things, everything else has transformed under capitalism. Social relations, marriage, love, our relationship to our children, etc. Everything has changed under capitalism, so anti-Semitism would be no different. So that was our reading today for Neil MacMaster's book, Racism in Europe. We'll pick up on here at page 103. I wanted to end on 100, so 103 is even better as we near the end of this book. We'll pick up on anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and continue to chip away at this masterpiece of a text. I want to give a shout out to everybody who tuned in, whether you said something or not. Shout out to Ozzy. Shout out to Iman for leaving a comment and deleting it. And once again, if you have any books that you want me to read, put it in the comments. If you have anything that you think is interesting that we should read, put it in the comments. We will be reading all the comments for tomorrow's live stream as we continue to knock out this book. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.